In a new report, The Lever News details how Fox News' parent company, Fox Corporation, is aiming to write off the behemoth $787 million agreed to pay Dominion Voting Systems. Dominion sued Fox in March of 2021 for repeatedly making false claims that the 2020 election was rigged.
The massive settlement might have freed Fox from the embarrassment of a very public trial. The tax code might just rescue them from the financial punishment. Here to discuss how one line in the tax code could help Fox News, after all, is The Lever's Julia Rock. Julia, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me on today.
So, Julia, this was a scoop of sorts by The Lever. What's going on here? Is Fox going to be able to substantially avoid paying this enormous, nearly $800 million judgment because of the tax code?
I mean, to answer the big question, yes, Fox gets to write off this massive deduction, this massive settlement as a tax deduction. And, you know, $787 million, sometimes it's hard to know what a number like that means for a company like Fox. But that's actually a huge portion of their 2022 profits, which we can imagine will be substantially similar this year, although maybe the loss of Tucker calls that into question. But yes, because of a line in the tax code that allows companies to write off ordinary and necessary business expenses, which the IRS has long interpreted to include settlements like this one, Fox can write it off.
And you know, for those of us like myself who do not enjoy paying taxes and are thus not as informed as we should be on, you know, what this all means, by writing it off, that means they're essentially not going to pay taxes on this amount of money, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And probably the best way to think about it is, you know, Fox is a company that's headquartered in New York, so they're paying federal and state income taxes, which are somewhere between a quarter and third of their income. And so if you can write off, you know, $787 million, that could amount to tax savings of more than $200 million.
And to be clear, this is something that, right, as you said, the IRS has said, yes, this kind of thing can be written off. This is not specific to Fox. They're not getting like real creative in a way that no one else has ever thought of. This is actually how the IRS has interpreted this issue.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, a lot of sort of tax geniuses have been out on Twitter saying, well, of course they can write off this settlement. And it's like, yeah, maybe that's true. Of course they can write it off. I think, you know, some of the logic for not changing the policy is that you sometimes have companies, you know, facing really small petty lawsuits and they're going to settle them. This $787 million for defamation, you know, is a huge settlement. And of course, there were costs to Fox's lies about the election that go far beyond the damages to Dominion.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like not that, you know, Fox News is trying to do anything under the table or, you know, that is inappropriate here, but it does call into question why it is that it seems over and over again the tax code advantages corporations, the affluent, in ways that working people don't seem to be getting these kinds of tax breaks. Whether or not we're talking about the difference between how much you're able to write off in interest payments on your $1 million house versus your $30,000 loan payment. On one, you can write off on the entire interest up to now, I think it's a $750,000 house. You can only write off up to $2,000 worth of interest for student loans. Those kind of differences seem to really underscore the fact that the tax code seems to have been written with the rich in mind as opposed to ordinary Americans.
Absolutely. Something doesn't sit right about it. And it's like, even in the moment, you know, when a company is maybe finally having to pay some cost for engaging in massively harmful activity, like there's still a catch. Where there's some way they can, you know, benefit from it. That's, yeah, just, you know, business as usual.
Yeah, I mean, the whole system, I do recall, you know, from going through my taxes every year, like what you can write off. I work with someone who's more of an expert, my brother-in-law actually, and he's like, oh, you could write off this, but not this. And it seems totally confusing, and also an advantage really to people who like have the time and the resources to go through it very systematically versus everyday ordinary working people who do not have that extra time, or like people who have kids and their kids take up their time. It just seems so complicated and so designed and not to help people actually just pay, you know, what they owe and then move on.
And I think it's actually revealing that, again, sort of tax experts were like, yep, of course, no problem, they'll write it off. And yet the sort of general reaction to this piece of information has been, this is appalling. It's like there's some world in which this is a completely normal, unremarkable fact. And then there's some other world, which is most of the world, where it seems like the American taxpayer is getting ripped off at the expense of Fox.
I mean, this reminds me of how galling it was to people when they realized that Jeff Bezos, we're talking the richest people in the world here, managed to pay $0 in federal income. I think it was back in 2007. And that was largely because he was able to offset the $46 million in income with reported losses from investments and deductions and debts and other expenses. So again, it really does feel like this is a code for the elites and not the code for working people who get very little in the way of these tax breaks. To Robbie's point, this is my first year as a kind of a solo entrepreneur, first full year, and my accountant was saying, well, can you write some stuff off? And I was like, I don't think so. My business expenses are like, I buy clothes to wear on the air, and he says clothes don't count.
Yeah, clothes don't count. Laptop doesn't count.
That's all I bought is a laptop.
If you had a
and clothes.
meeting with someone and you talked business, that could be written off.
So I can go to a fancy dinner with my podcast guest, but I can't buy a new mock neck turtleneck to wear while I'm interviewing them.
I think so. I'm not giving tax advice on the air for legal reasons, but I think that is how it works.
Yeah.
Which makes no sense.
So Julia, and your perception is that there has been a public outcry over this. Do you think there's any kind of political momentum to try to do anything about it? There's been a lot of conservative interest in an IRS agent hiring by the Biden administration. Do you imagine this developing in any way that's kind of like politically productive here?
I mean, I hope so. There have been some, progressive Congress people saying they're going to introduce legislation to do something about this, and I only roll my eyes because there's no way something like that gets to this Congress. But the last big scandal about write-offs like this was before the major drug companies settled with state and local governments over pushing opioids onto their communities. They were telling investors, we're going to be able to write off, I think it was like more than $4 billion in taxes. And Congress did move to sort of narrow a little bit write-offs in situations where companies were paying settlements to governments. So maybe there's going to be something here. Again, it's hard to imagine legislation going anywhere, but there have been some responses from progressive lawmakers saying this is no good.
Interesting stuff. Julia Rock, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on.